Okay, hi. Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Clarissa Cortland. I'm a social psychologist by training, and currently I'm a postdoctoral researcher at INSEAD in Singapore. And today I'd like to share with you some work I'm doing in collaboration with Zoe Kinius, also at INSEAD in Singapore, about how experiences with bias and stereotyping can be integral to driving change. So in this work, Zoe and I are very interested in when women are more likely to speak out against the imbalance and the bias they see around them and to stand up for themselves and for other women. And there are many reasons for why women may be more or sometimes less motivated to speak out and support driving change toward gender balance. In this work, we're really interested in the role that stereotype threat has to play. And by stereotype threat, I'm referring to the distracting and often cognitive resource depleting fear of confirming negative stereotypes. And here you see with women in leadership. And the reason we're interested in this is because at first blush, stereotype threat is typically associated with very deleterious outcomes in terms of undermining performance and reducing engagement, motivation, and interest in the negatively stereotyped domain. However, we find across 3 studies that stereotype threat can also be fundamental to driving change. So here's an overview of the 3 studies. The first 2 studies are correlational studies. In study 1, we administer a survey to MBA students with global representation at a unknown international graduate business school with campuses in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And in study 2, we administer a survey to all living alumni from the same business school, again with global representation and with significant leadership experience. So in both of these studies, studies 1 and 2, we asked these global business leaders and leaders-to-be to report on their experiences with stereotype threat, their school or work engagements, and their change motivations, both attitudinal and behavioral support for gender balance. And then in study 3, this was an experiment that was meant to assess causality. And in this study, we randomly assigned a sample of working adult women located in the United States to either one of 2 conditions, a control condition or a stereotype threat condition. And then we measured change motivations. And I'll give a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. So focusing first on the first 2 studies, the correlational studies, we found significant correlational evidence supporting that experiencing stereotype threat was linked with these negative outcomes in terms of disengagement at school or at work. And this replicates decades of past work looking at negative outcomes associated with stereotype threat. However, importantly, and supporting our novel contribution, we find that stereotype threat seems to predict an increased support for driving gender balance among women in the sample. And this is both reporting their attitudes supporting gender balance and also the reported behaviors, including an increased likelihood to mentor and advocate for other women. And it's important to note here that both of these samples included women and men, and these relationships were significant only for the women in the sample. So we can say then for global business leaders and leaders-to-be that stereotype threat seems to be a process that drives support for gender balance among women but not among men. Again, this was all correlational evidence, so in order to test causality, we ran an experiment. And in this experiment, we randomly assigned women to either think about what they did last Tuesday in a control condition, or to think about a time when they were worried about confirming negative gender stereotypes at work, and then to write about that experience. So those are the 2 conditions you see on the x-axis here. And what we found was, compared to the control condition, women reported increased support for gender balance in leadership. And we found that this extended to behavioral intentions as well. So compared to the control condition, women reported increased intentions to mentor and advocate for other women, this being an example of an action that can be taken to drive progress toward gender balance. And I wanted to end with this quote here, which I think nicely summarizes a major takeaway of this work, which is that when women leaders like me do not feel the inequality, sorry, not me, but her, we tend to forget that something is not working. So this suggests that there's something about really feeling and experiencing and acknowledging the inequality that seems to drive change motivations for women. And while the research I report here is on an individual level, so individual perceptions, motivations, and experiences, we like to think about how this translates to the organizational level as well. And we encourage very careful and thoughtful planning around organizational intervention efforts and policy implementation to ensure that these well-intentioned initiatives don't merely reduce women's perceptions of bias where it exists, in an effort to find a quick remedy for improving women's workplace experiences, and in so doing, inadvertently pacify change motivations where they, in fact, are very much warranted. Thank you.